She wasn't afraid.
She didn't seem afraid to you? Okay. Based on anything she told you, did you have concerns about her safety around this woman?
No.
In between the time that Rusty was murdered and the time that Henry Newman was arrested, what, if anything, did Andrea tell you about being afraid of Henry Newman?
He was her friend.
That's what you understood the relationship to be?
Absolutely.
Right up until the day he was arrested?
Up until the time that she received an email when we were in Florida.
Okay. I'm going to ask you some specific questions about that, but before I do, I want to be specific. What, if anything, in the days after Rusty's murder, did Andrea tell you about suspecting Hemi being responsible?
It was unfathomable that her boss could murder her husband.
It wasn't something you all talked about?
That Hemi, Mr. Newman, would have murdered Rusty was unfathomable.
It didn't occur to you at all?
Why would her boss murder her husband?
And based upon what you knew, what Andrea told you, did you have any reason to believe that he would?
No.
Did you have any reason to think that Mr. Newman had a motive to murder Rusty?
No.
If you had known, what would you have done with that information?
If I had known,
If you had known that Hemi Newman had a motive to murder Rusty, what would you have done with that information?
Yeah, I'm going to object as to what she would have done. What she would have done is irrelevant to this proceeding.
Well, this is relevant, Ms. Cross. What she would have done.
I'll move on now.
All right, I sustain that objection.
Prior to the time that Rusty died, had you and Andrea ever talked about her getting a divorce?
absolutely not.
Had it ever come up at all?
Never.
I asked you specifically about Andrea divorcing Rusty. In the months leading up to Rusty's murder, had you and Andrea ever talked about the topic of divorce in general?
No.
No. Did you observe anything between Andrea and Rusty that made you think that that was something that was a possibility?
Absolutely not.
In December of 2010, did you travel to Florida?
Yes.
Okay. And how long after Rusty's murder on November 18th, 2010, did you travel to Florida?
Once our granddaughter was finished with school, it was vacation.
Sophia was in what?
Holiday vacation.
Holiday vacation? Do you remember the specific dates?
I do not remember whenever school let out, we left soon after.
Okay. And who traveled with you?
My husband, our daughter Andrea, and our 2 grandchildren.
You talk about Sophia and Ian, Andrew's children.
Yes.
At the time you went to Florida, had anybody been arrested for Rusty's murder?
No.
To your knowledge, at the time you went to Florida, was there a primary suspect in Rusty's murder?
No.
Did you suspect anyone at that time?
Prior to going to
At the time you
Florida?
traveled to Florida,
No.
do you know or did Andrea communicate to you if she suspected anyone at that time?
No.
Did you have conversations with Andrea about the investigation?
Yes.
Did you have conversations with Andrea about her cooperation with the police?
Absolutely.
To your knowledge, had Andrea communicated with the police about her relationship with Mr. Newman?
Yes.
And to the best of your knowledge, what she told them was consistent with what she told you?
Yes.
So tell me then, what, if any, communication do you know about between Andrea and Hemi Newman after Rusty's murder?
We were in Florida. Andrea received an email from Hemi Newman.
Prior to receiving that email from Hemi Newman, do you know if there was any contact between Andrea and Hemi Newman after Rusty's murder?
I do not believe there was any contact.
You don't know anything, or the defendant didn't tell you anything about a late-night phone call on November 19th, 2010?
Yes, she did.
She did tell you that? What did she tell you about that?
She said that she called Mr. Newman to let him know that she told the police. She gave the police his name.
You were present for the interview with Andrea and the police on November 19th, 2010. Is that right?
I was
Okay, where did that interview take place?
in Andrea's home in Dunwoody.
Were you there the entire time?
Yes.
Who else was there?
My husband, our son, 2 police officers, and the Snydermans.
When you say the Snydermans, who are you referring to?
Donald and Marilyn Snyderman, Rusty's parents.
Okay. And so if you were present through the entirety of the November 19th interview, are you aware that the police asked Andrea and Andrea provided information about many people during that interview?
Yes.
Do you know if Andrea called any of the other people that were mentioned during that interview?
I do not.
When was it that Andrea told you that she called Mr. Newman to alert him that she had provided his name to the police?
I don't recall. It was either she said before she made the phone call or after.
Okay. Close in time to when the call was made, to your understanding?
Yes?
Were you present when the call was made?
No.
Did you overhear any of it?
No.
Outside that phone call on November 19th, 2010, you were telling me about the next communication you knew of between Andrea and Mr. Newman. When was that?
I believe it was the 28th of December.
And tell me about the communication with
Mr. Newman emailed Andrea.
How do you know that he emailed Andrea?
We were sitting in our living room, dining room area, and Andrea was going through her emails, and she said, "There's an email from Hemi Newman here."
What else did she say?
She read it to us.
Do you remember the content of it?
I do not remember the entire content, but it said something like, "I still care for you, ... I didn't, ... And then there was a reference to an iTunes song.
Do you remember any particulars about the reference to the iTunes song? Like what the song was, or the artist, or anything like that?
Stay the way you are, just the way you are. I don't know.
It wasn't familiar to you at the time, or
No.
did it?
I
Go ahead.
don't listen to a lot of current music, so I don't know.
It didn't occur at all. What was the conversation, or what can you tell me about what Andrea told you after she showed you the email?
Andrea wanted to notify the police, and I was very concerned for her safety.
Why were you very concerned for her safety?
I'd been concerned for the safety of Andrea, our grandchildren, and us from the day that Rusty was murdered.
But you just said, if I recall, that there wasn't anything that you suspected about Mr. Newman prior to that time. Is that right?
That is correct.
You didn't have any discussions about being concerned about Mr. Newman in particular. Is that right?
That is correct, until she received that email.
What was it about that email that caused you concern?
There was just something about it that made me uncomfortable.
What was Andrea's reaction to it?
She wanted to notify the police, and my response was, I'm concerned for your safety. What if Mr. Newman has access to your computer? What if he knows where we are?
Mrs. Greenberg, what made you think that Mr. Newman would have access to your computer?
To Andrea's computer?
To Andrea's?
I don't know enough about technology. I don't know whether I'm understanding that people can get into other people's computers many different ways. I was concerned for her safety.
What made you think that Mr. Newman would have access to Andrea's phone?
Phone?
Did you just express a moment ago you were concerned that Mr. Newman was monitoring Andrea's whereabouts?
No,
You weren't concerned about that.
that isn't what I said.
What did you say?
What I said was, I'm concerned that he may know where we are.
What caused you to be concerned about Mr. Newman knowing where you were?
Andrea shared with us that friends of hers had texted or emailed that Mr. Newman was in Florida.
At that time, did Andrea say anything about being afraid of Henry Newman?
She did not say she was afraid of him, no.
Mrs. Greenberg, do you recall giving a sworn deposition in a related matter?
I do.
And do you recall the date of that deposition?
I do not.
Does November 16th, 2012 sound familiar to you?
I don't recall the date.
Okay. You were sworn at that deposition, is that correct?
Yes.
And you answered questions related to the testimony, or similar to the testimony that you're giving this morning, is that right?
Yes.
Do you recall being asked at that time about the email that Andrea received on December 28th, 2010?
I do.
Do you recall being asked if Andrea had described or if she had told you what the content of that email was?
I do not recall my response.
Your Honor, may I approach the witness?
You may.
Ms. Greenberg, I'm going to direct your attention to a transcript. I'm going to ask that you read beginning on line 22, and for the record it's page 111, and continue on through line 5 of the following page. And when you've done that, can you let me know that, please?
Finish reading, just look up.
Yes.
You ready?
Thank you, Your Honor. Do you remember now being asked if Andrea had described the content of the December 28, 2010 email to you?
Yes.
And what was your testimony at that time then?
What was the question again?
I asked asking what your response was when you were asked under oath if Andrea had described the content of the December 28, 2010 email from Henry Newman to you. What did you respond?
I believe I responded no.
But your testimony today is that you do have a recollection of it.
Absolutely.
And at the time you gave a sworn deposition in November of 2012, you didn't have a recollection of it.
I did not have a recollection at that time.
Okay.
I believe I was being questioned for over 3 hours. I was exhausted.